on today's episode of Retrial Podcast.
Part of what happens is the government paints your client as some evil monster. And for a while, I would have been willing to live next door to any of my death row clients.
Say that again, just so I could hear that. I think I want to hear that again, just so people are clear.
For quite a while, I would have been willing to live next door to any of my death row clients.
Wow.
Now that's not true now. Okay?
Welcome. We're back. Episode 3 of Retrial Podcast, where we decode legal history that happened in Dayton, Ohio. These cases, lawyers, and stories set the stage for present-day learning across our nation, hosted by trial attorney and the great historian Dave Greer and myself.
I'm not so great.
Yeah,
but...
I think you're great. I'm going to say you're great. And myself, Judge Gerald Parker. On this episode of Retrial, we started with abortion. We moved to NCR, antitrust litigation. Now, we're going to stay on the more morbid train, and we're going to talk about death penalty. Is that right, David?
A nice, simple, logical transition.
I appreciate that. So, again, we're going to learn a lot from two individuals who've had some very, very personal experiences representing those involved in death penalty cases. Our special guest, Gary Crim, local attorney here, Dayton, Ohio. Been doing it just a couple years or so, not too long. Been here for some time. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate you being here. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Glad to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Death penalty, Dave Greer. How do you want to start? I don't even know how to start things off when you start talking about
Well, I think I got a way to get it started.
All right.
We all come crying into this world, and everybody laughs. And we all go laughing out of it, and everybody cries. Now, the second part of that may not be true in the instance of the death penalty. Not everybody cries. Yeah. Although the unique thing about it in my mind is that we all know we're going to die. That happens to everybody. Sooner or later, you're going to die. But you don't know that it's going to be next Wednesday at 4 o'clock, which puts a whole new spin on that concept of the death that embraces us all at one point. Now, Gary, who is with us this afternoon, has spent a good part of his life dealing with people who have to deal with that problem. And I think I'd just like to hear how that's been.
Well, being present, I've only been on site. I've not been in the death chamber in any of the executions. I was on site for a couple of them. And in many ways, those cases were almost state-assisted suicide. They were both of the people were Mr. Mink and Mr. Ferguson were both volunteers. They had pled guilty. They had tried to waive their appeals. You couldn't. The Ohio Supreme Court doesn't let you waive the first appeal, and so that's where I was involved and was the first appeal. But both of them, once those were over, they would not authorize anything further. And they had me down there because I knew that on site, because if they changed their minds, there would be, I could file something and it would get taken care of.
I think Emanuel Nadland was the last Dayton lawyer who actually saw his client die in the electric chair in Columbus. A tough experience that nobody would want to have. Although Jack Egan, who had, I think, one of the first people killed in the electric chair in the state of Ohio, not only attended his client's death, he and the client's girlfriend put the body on the train and brought it back to Dayton to bury it. So you haven't had to do that.
No, I have not had to do that.
Well, so according to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, there are currently 122 prisoners housed on death row. Mm-hmm. Ohio now hasn't executed anyone since 2018. Today marks the 5-year anniversary of Ohio's last execution, which took place in 2018. In July, I think it was actually July of 2018 was the last execution. And now Ohio, interestingly enough, joins 15 other states without an execution in the last 5 years. Now, although there is no formal moratorium, Governor Mike DeWine has issued several reprieves due to concerns about the lethal injection protocol and the difficulty the state has had obtaining lethal injection drugs. Ohio has executed 56 people in the modern death penalty era, placing it 8th overall in the number of executions in the United States. Starting in 1897, Ohio first used the electric chair. Electrocution replaced hanging and is seen, and at the time was seen as a more humane method of execution. It's weird for me to say that, but I did just say that because that is what my research has come about. So death, why is it so interesting? The Green Mile, remember that movie? Shakespeare loves to talk about it, I don't know, Dave. It seems like it's one of those things where the mercy of death is when you don't know how or when it happens, of course, But here in this instance, in death penalty, you do know and potentially could know how it's going to happen.
Well, Gary is here to tell us where the sting of death is.
Yeah.
Tell us what you've been doing for a living for the last decades.
There have been very few executions. And the death penalty overall, if you'd have asked me 30 years ago when I started doing this on a more timely basis, I would have projected a lot more people on Ohio's death row. There was a lot of, it was a partisan political issue, and people were running for public office based on, we're going to put more people on death row. There were many counties where the death penalty, if it was conceivable they could charge a death penalty, they would indict on death penalty grounds. Montgomery County was not one of those. When I was hired into the prosecutor's office just after the Scott case, my deal was that I would not have to work on a death penalty case. There was only one death penalty case at the time. And my family have been pacifists going back generations. Right. And so that was the deal. I had the tools to do most of the criminal appeals, but I simply would not work on a death penalty case. And Scott became, I don't know if it was by the time it was argued in the Hamilton County Court of Appeals, but it became a non-death penalty case after Lockett. So but what's happened in the last 30 years is fewer and fewer people are being sentenced to death. Juries are coming back saying you shouldn't sentence people to death. And prosecutors have gotten some of that message, and they're not charging death as much as they used to. Right. In Montgomery County, they've always reviewed cases and decided whether or not they should go death. And this goes back way back beyond my practice.
Yeah, it's always been in Dayton or Montgomery County. It's always seemed to me that the ones where they go for the death penalty are ones where there is a really lurid and dramatic and appalling murder. You go up to Columbus in the old days, anytime that somebody got shot in the commission of a felony, they go for the death penalty. Now, whether that's good or bad, you can debate, because so often the dramatic, lurid, nasty, ugly, terrifying things that result in murder, the people who perpetrate them are probably never likely to commit another crime. I don't know whether you agree with me, Gary, or not, but they're where emotion just kind of blows you apart like the peanut butter jar that you take the top off and all the springs fly out.
There's a phrase, death is different. And when I look through many of the people who end up committing murders have been victims earlier in their life. It's just, that's sort of the way it was. And if you get people, the number of, talked about the Scott case, that was committed in a kidnapping situation. Not a lot of organized kidnappings are, that's a fairly rare occurrence. Someone may grab a car and take a victim for a while, but that doesn't necessarily, the people that actually end up killing people, you're much more likely to be killed by a relative or a friend than you are by a stranger. That doesn't mean strangers don't come and do things. But the kinds of people who commit them, I think about half of my clients, the first time they committed a felony was when they killed someone. Right. And so they're not people that have the worst of the worst is what they call them.
Can we talk, that's interesting. Can we talk about your career? So just so I'm clear, you've handled a lot of death penalty cases, correct?
Yes, I've been
Go ahead.
involved in about 15 death penalty cases.
But when you first started as a former prosecuting attorney in Montgomery County, as did I should say, you did not want to do any death penalty cases.
Right.
Make that make sense to me.
It's a it's what I learned from my parents and grandparents and at church.
Gotcha.
That was the way I was brought up.
Absolutely.
And when Lee hired me, he knew my background.
Yeah. Okay.
He had the office, in fact, on the civil side represented my dad as a county school superintendent. So it wasn't like I was interviewing for a line position. I came in specifically for the appellate sec to handle the appeals.
I see.
And that was a deal, and Lee knew those things when he hired me.
And then
And there was only one case.
Okay, yeah.
And it stopped being one case.
Right.
Within a few months, Lockett came down sometime that spring, I think. And there was an interregnum in the death penalty cases. And one of the reasons I left the office was I knew that you couldn't do my job and not take death penalty cases.
I see, I got you.
There were other reasons too.
Yeah, of course. And then when you leave to, I guess, go into private practice, and you openly wanted to start taking those
Actually,
types of
I didn't.
Okay.
I kind of stayed. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I spent a year with an insurance defense firm. I spent some time doing some bankruptcy work, some criminal appeals, but I enjoyed doing appeals.
Okay.
And I've only been involved at the trial level in one case. The rest of my cases were either direct appeals or some form of post-conviction or federal habeas corpus. And all that stuff kind of fit the way I function and work.
Yeah, gotcha. So you want to tell us a little bit about, either what you know about historical perspective from the death penalty and or what it's like. I mean, I think most people listening here are going to know what it's like to advocate on behalf of somebody serving on death row.
Part of what happens is the government paints your client as some evil monster. And for a while, I would been willing to live next door to any of my death row clients.
Say that again, just so I can hear that. I think I want to hear that again, just so people are clear.
For quite a while, I would have been willing to live next door to any of my death row clients.
Wow.
Now that's not true now. There are several people that are so mentally ill that I would not want to live next door to them, and that's the category I'd put them in.
Right.
But there are people they got into a specific situation and exploded. And they exploded against their family or against, other people. Yeah. Some of them were they're committing felonies. I'm not, this happens, and things kind of got out of control.
And I think that's what we all kind of find out if you're a lawyer and you do any of this work as criminal defense or appellate either way, that there are indeed a small and relatively easy to identify number of mad dogs that just need to be put away. And the Charlie Mansons and some of those types. There's a guy in the state prison system now that you give him about 2 minutes and he'll have killed somebody else who figures he's kind of impunity. You can't. What else can you do to me? But they are so rare. It's what Gary says, at least has been my experience too, that most of them are these explosive domestic things that just, why did you do it? And they're not crazy people. They don't need to be put in an insane asylum for the rest of life. In fact, one of the problems with defending them is you can't find a psychiatrist who will say that they're insane by this legal standards. But Gary, you've had a lot of them and done all the appellate work, and you might give everybody a little idea of what kind of labor goes into these things after somebody's been given the death penalty.
Part of it is more resources go into representing people later on. You get state court, but when you get into federal court, they pay much better and they provide more resources.
Right, absolutely.
But when you get into federal habeas, when I was in law school, when you filed a federal habeas petition, you could get a hearing. You could raise issues that hadn't been raised before, and the law they applied was the current law. All that's changed as far as federal habeas jurisdiction. You don't get a hearing except under rare circumstances. If it hasn't been raised in state court, you can't raise it in federal habeas. And the law they apply is the law that was applicable at the time of the crime or the end of the state case. And so these are all complexities that you have to kind of, when you get into habeas work, you've got to kind of weave around those issues. And it on one hand, it makes it interesting, but for a client, it can be very frustrating. In the European system, they ask, is this a fair sentence? While they don't have the death penalty, on reviewing cases, the judges ask that, and they decide if they don't think it's a good. In the U.S., what we did basically is, did somebody screw up? And increasingly, it's did they screw up really, really bad? And that allows a lot of cases to be tried to go to execution where it just isn't that way.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, go ahead.
The other thing I've looked at is in many ways we have a mental health tax. It's not fairly applied. A few families pay a horrible price for it. But because we don't fund mental health issues so that people have a way to deal with them without just sort of holding on to things until they pop, as you said, that some people pay a high price and the rest of us don't pay anything. But it's a very high price for a limited number of people.
So having done this for how many years have you?
I've been doing death penalty stuff almost 30 years
Almost
now.
30 years. And while no case is the same, do you see the same individual from 2024 as the same individual from 1985? Are these like carbon copy? Like there's nothing new under the sun type scenarios, or
they're all people. They're all individuals,
right?
And they have individual stories. And part of what you do, what I try to do as a lawyer, is to get their stories out. And in some cases, the representative have not done a very good job. I have one case down in, I'm thinking of in Cincinnati, where the defense lawyers basically never went and talked to the family. Now, my client was accused of, he confessed to killing his mother. And so all of her siblings and his brother and all these, none of the defense lawyers never went and talked to him. Yet they did a death penalty trial in Hamilton County on that basis. And when I told, ultimately, and one of the aspects of capital work is you handle segments. So you handle trials. Generally, you don't, unlike Manning Nadeline would have done. You handle trials, and then other people do the appeals. That's a lot of what I do. Other people handle post-conviction. I've done some of that. Right. Federal habeas, again, you frequently now get different lawyers for that. So you handle segments of a case. But when I got to, we handled it all the way through in the case in Cincinnati, I handled the state post-conviction and then the federal habeas. And basically, I got nowhere. There were some serious questions about the lawyers, but another group of lawyers handled the when it came time for him to be executed. I was able to, because of the manner of execution, there was a wave of means of execution cases in the early in the 2007 2008 period, and I got a federal judge to say, no, don't execute him, because what the state does isn't very good. And so he kind of waited out that period. But for him, being on death row was very tiring. And so he just withdrew from any further litigation. And his number came up. And when the parole commission held his case, the federal, I think it was a federal defender's office out of the Capital Habeas Unit in Columbus, handled the petition before the parole commission, and they presented a very compelling case, and the governor gave him clemency and sentenced him 20 to life, which he could have sentenced him 30 to life. Yeah. So that about 3 or 4 years ago, he wasn't executed, but after being in jail about 30 years, he was released on parole. And when you've spent 30 years in solitary confinement on death row, your social skills are not as good as they should be. And I think he may be back in, not for a new crime, but for, I think, drug use. And, well, technically that's a crime, but it's not, he hasn't created any more victims. And, but he's been in and out.
There used to be a thing that where you were representing the person prior to his being convicted is a whole different game from the appellate side of it. Because in that role as an attorney, you're that person's only friend left in the world. And the only way you can do it properly is the exact opposite of what you were talking about in that Cincinnati case. You have to spend hours and hours with that individual, with his family, with his friends, with everybody else. So you develop a kind of a bonding relationship with the person, which makes it very difficult at the end of the game if that death sentence is pronounced.
Yeah, what's that like, the relationship that you obviously have with the mother, the grandmother, who are just maybe pleading, and maybe you have a case where your defendant is like, I'm done, just waives everything, but you've got a family that says he doesn't or she doesn't know what they want. Can you please argue? I mean, I'm sure you have certain types of different lines of communication between mom and the defendant.
You talk to people. I've learned generally in my criminal practice, I answer the phone. In 1995, I moved my office home, and I practice out of my house now. I've been doing that for a long time. Now, I am, as I learned on occasion, 10 minutes from Judge Rice's courtroom, but
that helps.
But so I would answer the phone and talk to people at all, whenever. Yeah. The problem, most of what I have done is not had that involvement with the families, and that's not really my skill set. Yeah. But the one case where we did have that, we couldn't, we had the client, getting that client to trust you is very difficult to do. Yeah. When you say, I'm from, the court has appointed me, I'm here from the government here, I'm here to help you, those aren't the most comforting words to someone who is sitting in a jail cell. And so you have to figure out ways to earn that trust. Yeah. And it's hard when everything you file keeps getting overruled and there's no sense of success or anything in that process. Yeah. The one case where we did try it, the jury came back guilty on the first phase of the trial. Our client refused to talk to us. And we had the mitigation phase coming up
next, the second phase.
In reality, that was all he had. But we were not in a position where we could do anything. And he did talk to the public defender's office, the mitigation specialist. And she came in and said, well, we'll get you another lawyer. And so they got another lawyer. Wow. Turned out that Adele and I had been co-counsel in a couple of other cases, and it worked fine because the jury came back with a life verdict in that case.
You know, there's so many death penalty cases that are still going on 20, 30, plus years. Many of them we can't talk about because they're still pending. But are there ones that you are able to talk about? Can you give us a case that you vividly remember?
Well, the ones that really get into the headlines that are big time public issues, Scott was probably the example of that, and the pressure that is placed on judges as well as on everybody else in a case like that. It was a kidnapping murder case, a $400,000 ransom, half of which has never been found, and the jury came back after being out for two or 3 days with a question for the court. And the question was, if we find the defendant guilty of kidnapping and extortion, do we have to find him guilty of murder as well? Because the victim was murdered. The victim of the kidnapping was found in a field, brutally murdered. To get the diamond ring off his finger, they cut the finger off. And so it was a kind of a nasty case. The defense was that while Scott had been involved in the planning of the kidnapping, he was not the one who, there were 2 other people involved, and they're the ones that actually snatched the victim who was supposed to be returned alive. So the jury asked the question, if we find him guilty of kidnapping, do we have to find him guilty of murder as well? The clear, simple, direct answer to that question is no. You have to find criminal intent to murder. And it went on for a whole day of lawyers arguing till they were red in the face. And the judge finally called them back. Here's the jury's question. The answer to your question is yes. And so he was convicted of murder just like that.
Wow.
That case had to be went up to the Supreme Court, reversed, was tried a second time. That went into a hung jury, tried a third time. So, you know, the pressure that is in these things is just unbelievable on everybody.
Yeah. That case, I entered the prosecutor's office after the case was tried. Before I actually argued it, it ceased to be a death penalty case, so I argued it in Columbus. But what that case did was it gave me, as the appellate lawyer, a lot of authority and power. And I literally sat in on any serious homicide case after that. And I can remember sitting in judges' chambers, Judge Yazel. And I went down to my office where I had the law books, and I did a 10-minute research job. I came back up, and the defense lawyers voted one way. I voted with the defense lawyers.
Okay.
The prosecutor went the other way. Judge Yazel looked around the room and voted with me and the defense lawyers. You know what happened?
The jury
hung. No. They got convicted. No. But do you know what happened when I got back downstairs?
What's that?
Nothing. Because I was doing my job. And everybody, the people, powers that be, knew I was doing my job.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I guess the end of the story is that all these death penalty things are tremendously taxing economically, emotionally on everybody. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, there's still plenty of people that believe if an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. But that ain't the law. And the law should have a healing process to the extent it's possible to have a healing process.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean there aren't a small number of people deserve to be exterminated.
Yeah. Wow.
But it's a small number.
Wow.
Let me shift to a couple of other related topics. One is a humane way of administering the death penalty. We seem to spend an awful lot of time searching for that humane way of killing somebody. I mean, we've come a long way from drawing and quartering like they did in the 16th century. And we've come a long way from public hangings where the pickpockets were rifling money from the crowds, and the public gallows, the electric chair. But if we really want a humane way, we've got a humane way. I was fishing in Michigan in October one year, freezing cold. The steelhead trout were jumping. It was a great fishing day. Hands are just like frozen stones at the end of the day, and we go into this cabin where this old guy's got a nice roaring fire and he's got cold beer, and we're sitting there in a couple of chairs watching the fire and thawing out. And says, "You boys comfortable?" I said, "Oh man, this is great. We're really cold and warm fire, cold beer. It could be better than that." I said, "Well, you aren't as comfortable as the two guys who were sitting in those chairs last weekend when Dr. Kevorkian was here and put them away." And he said, "You know, it was really beautiful. They were two people dying of cancer, and he just administered morphine to them, and they just drifted into sleep and disappeared. And we know that goes on a daily basis everywhere in this United States at various hospices and hospitals. But we don't seem to find a humane way of administering the death penalty to an individual. I mean, this latest thing with the nitrogen or whatever it did was another total disaster. The guy jumping around in agony for 5 minutes.
Part of it is the medical profession doesn't view its do no damage, do no harm. So they're not willing to participate.
Sounds like Pontius Pilate rather than do no harm.
They don't get involved, and the people who actually do the executions, they're not very skilled with things like needles and doing drugs. And we saw what they did in Alabama. What has been described as a very calm way to go didn't end up being that.
And of course, they have skill like that. It's something they have to do every day. They talk about Jack Ketch, the hangman in the 18th century in Britain, where he could hang you and you wouldn't even know what happened. It was all over. But then you got the other problem of, if you're a hangman, you got to have the right length of rope. It can't be too short, can't be too long, got to be just right. You got to have a sudden drop. There's an art to killing people. And unfortunately, the ones we give that job to, they don't have that art.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know what is going to be the opposite end of the spectrum here is the victims and their families that are going to look at everything that you're saying and are going to say certain words about everything that you're saying. In fact, I have some close friends and who have lost loved ones to some brutal murders, who would say the complete opposite as to, you know, for what it's costing to put these individuals away. What about the cost to keep them alive? And I'm not here to say one way or the other, but what do you say to the victims of the families in those instances?
I think that there's this idea somehow that the death penalty is going to make people better. That killing the perpetrator is going to make all the problems go away, and I don't think any psychologist would really agree with that. And in many cases, there are lots of times where the families of the victims, if they're how can I put it? There are, from the government's side, there are good victims and there are bad victims. And there are good victims if you agree that they should execute someone, and there are bad victims if you don't agree with that. And at the federal level, the defense world has developed victim contacts. There are people who work at developing contacts with the victims. And in many cases, the government lawyers don't talk to the victims very much, or they don't let them know what's going on. And those people have helped resolve some of these cases by talking to the victims. We've gotten the idea that that's how we should, that this somehow executing someone is going to eliminate the problems or issues that they have. That's not always the case. In Montgomery County, for example, with Scott Mink, he killed both of his parents trying to get money to buy cocaine. And we knew, before I got involved representing him, I knew some of the family members. One of the in-laws of the sisters was a soccer referee. He refereed some of our children's soccer games. And another one or two of them had children at the same high school where our boys went here in the city. And that by the time they left that Scott Mink left for death row, the probation department people some of the probation department people have victim crime, that sort of thing. They had met, and there was a reconciliation going on with the family. So the family was visiting him. They had the rare problem of they had made use of some of the state resources. So for counseling and funeral expenses and that sort of thing. Well, they were sending money up to Scott so he could buy some books. And there was some bureaucrat in Columbus that was lopping onto that money that they had sent up to repay the money that they had spent earlier. And it took a while to realize if you get the account down to a certain, there are ways of working around it, but it was really screwy.
Yeah. Trying to accept what happens in life is something we all have to do. We all go through sorrow, we all go through pain, we all go through all those things. And while it's true that when you've got a friend or a loved one who has been a victim of a crime and dies, that there is that initial thing that is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In fact, the last capital case that I tried, there were 18 death specs, any one of which was a death penalty. So we went through the jury coming in 17 times with a life sentence. And on the 18th spec, they administered the death penalty. In the post-conviction proceedings, apparently one of the jurors had sent an email to the judge saying, they were going to be a hung jury on that last count. They weren't going to give him the death penalty there either. But I persuaded them that the law, lex talionis, trumps the state statutes, and that if you take somebody's life, you should pay for it with your own life. And I convinced the jury to give him a death sentence on that last one where they weren't going to do it. And he then gave in his voir dire, he had, done the perfect answer. No, I have no axe to grind either way, and I can be fair and impartial and what have you. But in the post-conviction proceedings, he gave a deposition and said, yeah, that's exactly the way I feel, and that's the way a lot of people feel. And if I hadn't explained to the jury the importance of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that man wouldn't have been on death row.
I'll never forget. So one of my college football teammates was telling me that he was in class, and this happened when I was in college. He was in class, and there was the class argument about the death penalty, and there's the folks for it, and there's the folks against it, and everybody's getting loud and going back and forth. And in that class was another teammate. So there's both teammates were in this class arguing. And my friend who was telling me the story said that I told him, you mean to tell me that if your mother was brutally murdered, you wouldn't want him or her to burn in hell or to be hung or to get the death penalty? Well, turns out that this teammate of mine also said, well, my mother was murdered when I was, I think, 6 or 7 years old, and that's not going to bring her back. Let's just say that classroom just shut down and nobody said a word after that. And I thought that was actually really interesting when he told me that story. There's also, when you do your research regarding the death penalty, there's also the cases in which they find that there's evidence that overturns the case, and it turns out that you have an individual that was we've got some cases that research folks in for 20, 30, 40 years, only to find out that they did not, in fact, commit the crime based off of new DNA evidence. And then also, of course, that the death penalty, I think it's pretty well solidified in the numbers that it disproportionately impacts people of color. Capital defendants charged with killing a white victim in Ohio are twice as likely to receive a death sentence as those charged with killing a black person. That's per certain research that's out there that anyone can find and see. So those are just some thoughts that I hear both sides of both arguments, but hearing from individuals who've actually argued, litigated, and have had that somewhat of a personal relationship, legal relationship as well with somebody on death row, makes you think a little bit more about it. And what do you think, why do you think there's been such a change with individuals on a jury in that second phase saying we're, not necessarily ordering the death penalty? Are we numb to the violence these days where it's just like, well, that's just how it is?
I would argue that we're probably less numb. Okay. I think what's happened is the defense lawyers have figured out how to present the information in ways that make sense.
Interesting.
And the government has its ability to counter that is much more limited. Mm-hmm. The first phase, the government can demonstrate what a horrible thing has happened. Mm-hmm. And the mitigation phase has become a way of explaining why this person is not the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's an old story of Solon, the philosopher in Greece, walking down the road, and there's some old man sitting there, and the old man is crying. And he says, well, why are you crying? He said, my son's been murdered. And, well, don't you know that crying won't bring him back? He said, that's why I'm crying. And, part of it is getting to people to get the catharsis to get through life and its hard places. Yeah. And that's true of the families of victims. And God knows they do have that kind of vengeance should be mine view. But to try to, as a nice pacifist like Gary can do, convince them that life is hard and you have to get yourself through it. And if you don't get yourself through it, then it eats you up and you become as bad as the person that you want your revenge on.
Wow. As of Tuesday, January 30th, 2024, Ohio Attorney General announced new legislation to authorize the use of nitrogen gas in executions in the state. Of course, a little bit was discussed about how that went in Alabama. Per this article that I read, they're seeking to they use the word kickstart. Kickstart Ohio's death penalty after a 6-year pause in executions due to difficulties obtaining lethal injection drugs.
And last year's news was that they're about to abolish the capital punishment in Ohio.
And that's what's interesting. That's why I brought that up. Is there's also bipartisan efforts, both sides of the aisle, who are kind of looking at the right to life, which we just talked about in the first episode, as similarly now into what they also view now as the right to life as well. So a lot of things happening within the legislature. So I just found that to be interesting.
Yeah, I think the bill is still it's pending, and it's given more opportunity, better chance than it was maybe 10 years ago. And so I don't. Politics is hard, and the local papers don't really cover it very well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Mr. Crim, thank you. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Heavy stuff. So we've tried our best to make sure that folks get a full understanding of folks who have been in the fight for folks' lives and folks who have been also victims of crimes and coming to some understanding so people are knowledgeable of how things happen in the court system. And I guess thank you so much for that. Be sure to subscribe and like us and give us some good reviews. If you don't, start your own podcast and we'll make fun of yours as well, and then we'll do some reviews of our own. How about that? On the next episode of Retrial Podcast, we learn about the business of law and the growth of legal service marketing. That's going to be fun. A little bit more light than I think what we discuss here, but that's kind of the world that we live in. So thanks again, Gary Crim. My man, Dave Greer, thank you so much, and thanks for supporting Retrial Podcast. This was episode 3. This Dayton Bar Association and Dayton Bar Foundation project was funded in part by a grant from the Dayton Legal Heritage Foundation and the Jack W. and Sally D. Eichelberger Foundation of the Dayton Foundation.